11/19/21 as the date. And that's all you need to do, but it's just one of those boxes that you literally have to check. So first and foremost, the EHP section does not apply to any CCB projects. So if you are proposing a plan update, that kind of thing, EHP review is not required. Pre-award costs may include preparation of EHP documentation if your project is awarded. Depending on where your project may be located, there could be a considerable amount of EHP documentation required, so those costs may be included. Any project involving a change to a structure or site may involve a higher level of environmental and historic preservation review. Projects involving new ground disturbance are evaluated for potential impacts to archaeology resources and wildlife habitat. And I think either Jaleesa mentioned it earlier or at another workshop, like something, even a generator. If you're doing ground disturbance, you're going to need to proceed with EHP review. But very importantly, a yes answer to any of the EHP questions does not mean that the project will not be funded, only that special issues must be reviewed and resolved in a satisfactory manner prior to obligation of funds. So your project may be, in a particular area, a historic district, it may have some caveat that goes with it, but that's not necessarily an issue. You just need to make sure that whatever your project is, any impacts that may be associated with it, considerations are addressed in this process. You also must provide all of the relevant EHP materials with the FEMA Go submission. So everything that you need must be attached. And when they are reviewed, if they are not, that means the application is essentially, it's missing a very important piece of the puzzle. So just kind of in general, what is EHP review? Environmental and Historic Preservation is what the acronym stands for. It's the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA's policy to integrate environmental planning and historic preservation considerations into its hazard mitigation, disaster response and recovery, and emergency preparedness activities. Through its EHP program, FEMA engages in a review process to ensure that their funded activities comply with various federal EHP laws and associated executive orders. Ultimately, the goal of these compliance requirements is to protect the nation's water, air, coastal, wildlife, agricultural, historical, and cultural resources, as well as to minimize potential adverse effects to children and to low-income and minority populations. So the federal money, they want to make sure that whatever they're funding, it has no adverse impact and that the resources that are sensitive and valued are protected and considered as a part of the undertaking. So what is NEPA? NEPA stands for the National Environmental Policy Act of 1969, and it requires that the federal government examine the proposed impacts of its actions before project implementation. So NEPA actually forms a framework for the coordination and demonstration of compliance with any study, review, or consultation required by other environmental laws. So it's organizing it for you. For example, the need to comply with another environmental law, such as the Clean Water Act, may be identified within the framework of the NEPA process, but NEPA itself is not the source of the obligation. So if theoretically the requirement to comply with NEPA were removed, compliance with each applicable law would still be required. State, local, or tribal processes cannot replace NEPA compliance. However, the materials prepared for other entities like the State Historic Preservation Office, the Maryland Historical Trust in Maryland, can be submitted with the EHP review materials in FEMA Go. Fortunately, we're all looking at the same kind of information and there is a consistency in terms of how it's reviewed. So it allows you to use that documentation more than once if you have to. And NEPA compliance has always been included in the special conditions of the grant award and the grant guidance. So it's been around for a while. A lot of times people aren't aware of it because they don't necessarily know that it's NEPA, but NEPA is really that framework that governs this entire process. And just to let you know, which you will immediately forget, and that's completely fine, the environmental laws and executive orders that are part of NEPA, there are categories: biological laws, water resources laws, socioeconomic laws, pollution control and debris management. And for historic properties, there's the National Historic Preservation Act. So some of these may be familiar to you. Some of them may be more relevant to locations outside of Maryland, but all of these need to be considered when you are involved in a federal funded undertaking. So this is a question that I've heard many, many times. I know it's required, but why are we going through all of this trouble? And it really does improve a project. And you're looking for opportunities to present documentation that allows your project to be as low impact as possible. And so by considering these different aspects in your planning process, you may be able to identify an issue early and avoid an adverse impact to an environmental, a community, a historic resource very early on in the process. Additionally, it helps you plan for budget costs. So if you were proposing an elevation of a structure and find out through the EHP process that that structure was, George Washington's birthplace, I know, not, definitely not. But if it were, you would know ahead of time that this is probably going to be expensive, or these architectural features need to be preserved as a part of it. And you may need an architectural historian or other kinds of planning as part of the project proposal, and you can factor that in. Fundamentally, it's the law. It's not an option. You just have to do it. And you also need to make sure you complete the process to retain the funding. And that's really important. And to summarize, there are different roles and responsibilities in this process. And for you, the sub-applicant, your role and responsibility is to use the EHP screening form and checklist, which we're going to talk about in a little bit, to identify applicable regulations based on the proposed project description and its location. You will develop the appropriate materials for EHP review: maps, photos, drawings, materials, etc. And you will be completing the EHP section of the sub-application in FEMA Go with all of these necessary attachments. You will not need to initiate any consultation directly with the Maryland Historical Trust. That is not the role of the sub-applicant here. So just to be mindful of that as you're moving forward and putting together your application. MDEM will review your application package for completeness and ensure necessary environmental review information and documentation is included. So they're going to screen it and make sure that you have all of the necessary materials. It will also initiate the state clearinghouse process and coordinate with state agencies as needed. And so this is, again, you don't need to initiate through the clearinghouse. You don't need to go to MHT. MDEM will facilitate that for you. And MDEM will also submit all of the state sub-applications and associated EHP documentation, ultimately to FEMA. And finally, FEMA, they are the agency that will ensure that the project complies with all federal laws and executive orders, coordinates and conducts site inspections with the state as needed, provides any technical assistance to the state and sub-applicant if necessary. The project may be very complicated in an environmentally sensitive area, and FEMA can help coordinate that with the state and the sub-applicant. And finally, FEMA will coordinate consultation with other federal agencies if necessary. And depending on the project, if it's particularly complicated, that's a really useful role and something that you don't need to worry about. So I mentioned before the EHP screening form. This is a copy of what it looks like. And basically what it is it helps you kind of like go through a decision-making tree. What am I doing? Where is it going? What may I need? What resources should I consult? It is a questionnaire, and it's used by FEMA to facilitate the environmental and compliance review for your project and determine which regulations are applicable. The screening form and any associated materials may be included as an attachment to the sub-application in FEMA Go. However, it's good to know that completing that screening form is not a substitute for answering the questions within the EHP section in FEMA Go. What it does with the attachments is provide supporting material to positively answer questions within the sub-application, and it helps you work through that thought process. The form provides technical guidance for supplemental documentation, including supporting photographs for project submissions. And importantly, all projects are assessed under Nepa and the National Historic Preservation Act, regardless of the scope of work. There may not be an impact, but it still needs to be assessed. And the EHP screening form can help you do that. The basic information that you likely already have, if you manage to get to this part of the BRIC process, is the project location, the address, lat long, GPS coordinates, project location map, preferably an aerial, point of contact, very important, date that structure was constructed, and a detailed scope of work. What are you doing, where you are doing it, how you are doing it. You want to include clearly labeled color photographs at ground level, showing the exact location of activities. If it requires ground disturbance, even like you're laying a concrete pad for a generator, dimensions, acreage, square footage of structure and or land affected. A project site map with areas and activities labeled, including any equipment or material staging areas. And design drawings, if possible, showing where equipment will be installed or for construction activities. So this is a tool and information sheet that is available on MDEM's website. It has different kinds of categories of information where you can find different GIS data. In addition, make sure that you look at your own local hazard mitigation plan, any other master plans, sustainable community plans, green infrastructure plans. You may have already identified some of these environmentally or culturally sensitive areas in other plans and have that information handy for you. So you may not need to even reinvent the wheel. That information may be out there for you. You just need to find the right source. And this is a really good resource of all of these different, these are cited sources. So these are primary sources that you can use. So again, the EHP laws and executive orders, which are the basis for FEMA's EHP review, mainly are the Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, Migratory Bird Treaty Act, Clean Air, Clean Water, Farmland Protection. There are executive orders, environmental justice, floodplain, wetlands, and the Coastal Barrier Resources Act and Coastal Zone Management Act. So those are probably like the biggest ones that form the basis for the EHP review. And the National Historic Preservation Act is always applicable to all projects. Federally funded projects shall consider project impacts to resources eligible for listing or listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and that includes archaeology. So for this application, you would need a date of construction for each building in the project, a diagram or quad map, a consultation letter or other information about potential historic or archaeological properties in the project area, especially if they've been involved in another federally funded or state funded undertaking. You want to make sure you include the area of ground disturbance and any past uses of the disturbed area. So again, using generators, If you are putting a new generator, but it's in the place of an old generator, you're going to want to mention that, yes, this previously housed something that is no longer sufficient for this building, et cetera, et cetera. So those are the kinds of things that you want to include. Any historic structures or buildings that may be affected by a mitigation project must be named in the sub-application. Historic structures more than 50 years of age, which fortunately or unfortunately is in the 70s, everybody. So people think old, but it's actually not as old as you think it is anymore. You need to make sure you include more than the buildings, any historic districts, any object of historic importance. If you have a local preservation ordinance, that may not necessarily include resources that are on the National Register, but fit this criteria, you're going to want to make sure you include those as well. If a project will affect archaeological resources, the resource must be named in the sub-application. And be aware that because known archaeological resources may be considered sensitive information, a SHPO or Tribal Historic Preservation Office may relate concerns, but not necessarily supply all of the details. So for the Endangered Species Act and the Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, as applicable to relevant projects, the intent of the law is that federally funded projects shall seek to avoid adversely affecting threatened and endangered species and their critical habitat. The kind of information you need, again, is a consultation letter or other information about threatened or endangered species in the project area, information about threatened or endangered species or bodies of water in the project area and the potential of the project to impact those species, and a good site map. And the timing of construction for some projects may coincide with critical nesting or migration patterns of endangered species and wildlife. And in these cases, delaying construction until after these periods may mitigate the potential impact, and this time frame can be incorporated into the project schedule. And again, getting back to the early planning, this is the kind of thing that you will want to consider in the scoping phase as you're putting together your proposal, because this is not the kind of information you would want to find after the fact. You want to make sure you factor this into your project plan. So the Clean Water Act, Rivers and Harbors Act, and Executive Order 1/1990, protection of wetlands, again, as applicable. So the intent of these laws and regulations are to protect the nation's water resources. Together, they support the navigability of the nation's waterways, control proposed development on or around, I'm so bad at this word, navigable channels, and clean and maintain the water quality of the nation's water. The kind of information you will be looking to include are, again, another map, image, a topo, a wetlands map, and any consultation letter or other information about wetlands or waters of the United States in the project area. And those resources and that tip sheet, again, there are a lot of GIS resources that you can use to create project maps that have all of the updated information, and those resources are on that sheet. The Clean Water Act also has a permitting system under the direction of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Any wetlands that may be affected by the project must be shown in the sub-application. So for example, the proposed design for a drainage improvement project may destroy or impair a wetland area. So those considerations need to be included as a part of the project plan. Executive Order 1/1988, again, floodplain management as applicable. The intent of this order is that federally funded projects shall avoid adverse impacts associated with the occupancy and modification of floodplains whenever there is a practical alternative. So again, getting back to that early integration into the planning process, if you have a practical alternative, you're going to want to consider that early on. The type of information you need to include: maps showing floodplains and floodway designations in the project area, and any documentation of probable floodplain management impacts in the project area. This is separate from the National Flood Insurance Program. The floodplain maps and information produced for the flood insurance program are excellent resources to use for estimating impacts to floodplains. Floodplains, floodways, drainage ways, watercourses, etc., within proximity of the project location must be shown. There is a good possibility that the project area of a flood mitigation project will be located within a regulated floodplain area. And even though flood mitigation projects will result in reduced flood risk to structures or an area, floodplain management requirements must still be followed. So again, including this early on in the planning process is really essential. So for example, if you have an elevation project, which is kind of common, this checklist describes the information that FEMA will require in order to complete the EHP review. So you're going to be looking again for the location, state the location of the project, site address, latitude, longitude, any maps, including a flood insurance rate map. Make sure the project site is clearly marked, aerial imagery drawings showing the location of the properties to be elevated, clear maps, good maps. Fortunately now, there are so many online GIS resources that you can use to make maps, print maps, save them, that you can definitely come up with something very clear for the reviewers. For your description of a project and your scope of work, you need to include that. That also talks about the type of elevation, any planned demolition, ground disturbance again, vegetation removal, and any kind of fill that you may propose to be used. Design information will be required should EHP review identify potentially adverse effects on buildings listed in or eligible for the National Register, either individually or as part of a district. And it's not uncommon to run into this, especially in older communities. A lot of times older communities are particularly vulnerable to flooding and are often considered for elevation projects. So that is really, really important to think of, right out of the gate, because it's very common to find a building over 50 years of age for an elevation project. It may not be historic, but you still need to consider the impact to it. Include the age of the building, the original date of construction, for a building or the structures, if there's more than one, located within that group proposed for elevation. Submit clear color photographs of each of the buildings to be elevated. We're going to talk a little bit about that later on, including one photo for each side of the building. Provide color photographs of the surrounding neighborhood taken from the site of buildings to be elevated. That's to provide context. Also include copies of other relevant information, such as environmental site assessments, remediation reports, historic property designations or surveys, including any archaeological surveys that you may have. And again, this is one of those times that some of your planning documents may help guide you who you need to speak with within your county or jurisdiction. They may have this information already for you. So just kind of figuring out what's been done, where, and what they've already produced documentation-wise, you may not need to do as much as you think. So what kind of EHP impacts should you consider for elevation projects? Structure elevation projects generally fall under FEMA's list of categorical exclusions that require minimal documentation to comply with NEPA, but compliance with other laws and regulations such as the Endangered Species Act, the National Historic Preservation Act, Clean Water Act, and Executive Orders 119 and 88 and 11990 is required. If your building is newer than 50 years of age, then, especially for cultural resources, you still have to address it, but it's not necessarily going to have an impact. So for National Flood Insurance Program floodplain management requirements, they contain special permissions that provide relief from the elevation requirement for historic properties located in special flood hazard areas. However, if the applicant and owner decide to proceed with elevation of the historic property, they still must meet the requirements of the National Historic Preservation Act. So you're going to have to avoid as many adverse effects as possible, because the elevation may alter the appearance and scale of the historic building and redefine its relationship to a setting. It may have a negative impact on a building's character, defining features. So when planning the elevation of flood-prone structures, FEMA advised communities to consider utilizing appropriate design, materials, and landscaping to avoid adverse effects to historic properties. And here's a little graphic that kind of, talks about some different variations of this theme. But again, considering this early on in the planning process, if you know that you're proposing an elevation for a structure that is contributing in a National Register Historic District, you are going to need to think about this, from the get-go. And those costs or any architectural studies or, additional information you may need to provide, this is the time to think about what is that going to cost? Do I need to include those costs in my application? And for NEPA, or for the National Historic Preservation Act, they use the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties as their, basically their guidebook on how to consider any adverse impact to an elevation project. And by minimizing that elevation, a building's original historic setting, scale, and distinctive features may be preserved, which will reduce the project's likelihood to have potential adverse effects. This is especially important if the property is contributing in a National Register Historic District, because a district is the sum of its parts. And if that structure or structures have a visually prominent place within the historic district, and you are thinking about elevating it, considerably high when even a lower height may be sufficient, that's the kind of adjustment you may need to make early on to avoid having that adverse effect to the historic district. So for acquisition and demolition projects, this is another checklist of project information. Again, same sort of information, the location, maps, where it is, make sure it's marked clearly, your scope of work for the project, your plans for the demolition, the level of ground disturbance, extent of vegetation removal, and grading plans. The information needs to be sufficient to provide a clear picture of the scope of the action being reviewed. Provide the date of construction for any buildings or structures located on the site to be acquired or demolished. Provide clear photographs of the buildings, including one photo for each side. Again, color photographs. Take the overall neighborhood contextual pictures. Clearly label your photographs for the location and orientation of the camera relative to the property being acquired, facing north, facing south, that sort of thing. Include copies of other relevant information, such as environmental site assessments and remediation reports, historic property designations or surveys, or archaeological surveys. When acquisition or demolition projects are most likely to impact historic properties, state and local governments must also consider federal, state, and local laws that relate to their projects' effect on floodplains, wetlands, endangered and threatened species, critical wildlife habitats, soils, prime farmland, water and air quality, low-income and minority populations, and other resources. And again, considering these things from the get-go will avoid some other problems later on and allow you to make adjustments in your project planning if necessary. So, National Historic Preservation Act considerations for acquisition and demolition projects. Removal of structures from areas of risk is the most permanent form of hazard mitigation. And while this may be the most practical solution for buildings subject to repetitive hazard events, and those that have sustained extensive structural damage, demolition of individual historic buildings or multiple buildings within historic districts have serious ramifications. And again, it's getting back to that idea that a historic district is the sum of its parts. So if you're proposing, acquiring and demolishing a block, and depending on the size of the historic district, that is a really significant undertaking. So when planning an acquisition of a hazard-prone structure, FEMA advises communities to ensure that no physical actions occur before historic buildings and archaeological resources are identified and environmental compliance review is complete. Basically, no preemptive demolition. A decision to demolish should be made only after extensive research of the historic property or district has been completed in order to fully understand the significance of the building or buildings that would be lost. So that's a part of the process, documentation. Again, the National Historic Preservation Act, that consultation does not necessarily prescribe an outcome. It's looking to minimize or avoid when possible, but getting back to the fact that it may be the most practical solution. Sometimes there is an opportunity to do really good, extensive documentation if a structure's loss may not be avoided. But again, that's something that needs to be included in the planning process. So also, again, where technically feasible, other options besides acquisition and demolition should be considered for historic structures. For example, this early portion of this warehouse building dates to the turn of the 19th century, and the building was adapted to be a visitor center despite the risk of flooding. And you can see, maybe not, but flood openings are visible beneath the unpainted brick along the river-facing facade. And this is in Williamsport, Washington County. But again, you know, being creative and having other ideas besides demolition, sometimes there are ways to maintain that historic structure, even if it is vulnerable, by, you know, having this discussion very early on in your process about ways to avoid demolition. And some general photography guidance for sub-application submission. This is easier said than done. And I think this is really important because photographs are required for so many parts of this project or any project submission, whether it's historic or not. And it can really make or break your application. And in the most case of the properties, these photographs will be the only and final record. So again, you're looking at this, you know this project so well, but the reviewers at MDEM and FEMA do not. So you want to be able to tell the story of your project very clearly for them because they're not going to know otherwise. So providing clear and easily understandable photo documentation is essential in assisting those project reviewers as they evaluate submissions, because I promise you, there's a lot of them. They get a lot of them. As the agency with oversight over the National Historic Preservation Program, the National Park Service provides guidelines and expectations on the quality of photographs and documentation as it relates to historic resources. And FEMA's recommendations for photograph standards are consistent with those issued by the NPS in order to facilitate any historic property consultations between FEMA and the SHPO, the Maryland Historical Trust. So consequently, you're not producing multiple types of photos for various agencies. It's pretty much a consensus that these standards and guidelines apply to photograph, you know, holistically, regardless of what agency you are submitting them for. If you are unclear if a photo is acceptable, refer to FEMA's guidance in their EHP screening form and or consult with the EHP staff at FEMA. Proper photographs following these guidelines will be required in order to complete this EHP review. So just some photo composition and quality do's and don'ts. Do make sure each application has review quality digital color photographs of every property. If possible, please name the photograph appropriately with the address and side of the building using cardinal directions, north, east, south, west. Again, because you know your project better than anybody. So you want to make sure that the reviewers will know this project just as well as you do based on the photo documentation that you provide. Do orient photos in landscape, horizontal display if possible. This orientation provides more space for content in photographs. And do provide JPEGs or TIFF files of photographs. Scans of photographs from appraisal documents or application pages and Google Street View screenshots will not suffice for SHPO review. This can be achieved by submitting the original photographic files directly from the camera or phone. So here's sort of a, just a little diagram showing, here's a regular house. these are sort of the angles in which you would consider taking your photographs that cover all of the major elements. And in addition, there's a link here on the slide to FEMA's Region 3 has put together a very useful photo guide for you if you need something to consult. So don't have people in the photographs. This includes owners, bystanders on porches, on the property, and in any project staff in the foreground. If you're taking it from a street, please avoid having walkers or anybody in front of, between you and the structure. Don't have obstructed views of buildings if possible. This includes tree coverage, car windows, and things on the street, such as a storage container and dumpsters. Taking photos from multiple viewpoints may be necessary, especially, well, fortunately, if you're taking pictures this time of year, you have the benefit of more leaves being on the ground. But there are definitely times of the years where, the landscaping may be, provide more of a challenge to you when getting a good photograph. So, providing as many views as possible will help, sort of fill that in if it's difficult to see. So again, don't supply scanned photographs. Scanned photographs mean the quality of the photos is lost not only once through the printing, but twice through the scan. And this leads to the photographs being grainy, too blown out, or too dark. Here's an example here. It's really fuzzy. It's hard to see the windows. It's hard to see the porch. So that's definitely something to avoid. And don't digitally alter the photographs in any way. Cropping, resizing, obscuring people. Just plan to take the photos without the people and with a perspective that shows all of the information that you need to provide for the review. And I think there's also a dog in this one. So as much as that's delightful, and I know the reviewers would love it, they really don't. So no dogs. So for building related projects, like here's a good example of a structure with, all the leaves are in the trees, but you really can't see the side of it because of it. So when you're taking photos of all four sides in their entirety, make sure to include your outbuildings, garages, barns, sheds, etc. But you may need, again, to take many more angles just to be sure that you get all of the elements included as part of the application. Do make sure there's adequate lighting in photos to ensure the features of the buildings are legible. Depending on the sun, sometimes if you're shooting right into the sun, it can be difficult for you, may not give you a good photograph. So those are considerations. And again, taking the photos at an angle, which gives a clear representation of the building. And include photographs of the surrounding streetscape for each property, and this provides context, especially in a historic district, elevation projects, demolition, all of those things, fundamentally important. And do verify that each subject property in the project is represented in the photographs and that the supplied photographs are of the correct building. And you can use Google Street View and or Google Earth to verify, but I mean, this sounds kind of crazy, but there are times where you may get a photograph for a project and the photograph is not actually, the subject of the project. So especially if you have a lot of people and it's a big project, you want to make sure that it's the right photo for the right property. Just also some basics for building related projects. Do take from a front view. Like this photo has a landscape orientation and provides a complete representation of the structure. Don't, this one is a don't. This photograph was taken at a crooked angle. Best portions of the facade is not visible. And for infrastructure projects, do provide photos of limits and disturbance of the project area and or surrounding areas. If multiple sites are in application, make sure you have clearly accounted for all the sites. Especially if it's like a very urban area, you need to make sure they are very well marked on the maps. Do provide photos of the ground if ground disturbance is involved. It may be the most boring picture of a slab in the ground or a place where a slab is going to go, but you need to do it. These photos provide context and show surroundings. They should always include that kind of information. Don't go take your photo or your camera right up to the ground and snap it. You need to provide that larger context. And some tips to make the reviews go smoothly. Again, I think I've touched on most of these, but complete and attach the EHP screening form to your FEMA Go sub-application. Again, it's not required, but it's really encouraged. It will very much help you stay organized. And with that in mind, provide well-organized attachments that are clearly named to aid the FEMA reviewer. They're reviewing a lot of these applications, so anything you can do to help them is a good thing. Conduct initial background checks for projects with buildings 50 years or older, and new construction projects with ground disturbance to learn if the property or site has a historic designation. Again, if you have a local ordinance, your local planning preservation staff really can help you here, and any other plans that you may have in your jurisdiction. Consult state and local preservation or planning agencies for known historic resources and archaeology sensitive areas. Provide well-designed maps with areas and activities clearly labeled. Identify any equipment or material staging areas. And submit professionally designed drawings when possible. And here's an example. And again, this is why talking to other people within your jurisdiction may be helpful. Someone else may have a professional design drawing that may not necessarily be available to another department. So coordinating amongst yourselves may, benefit you in the end by finding other documentation for your project. And so basic keys to success. Your legwork up front can shorten project review timeframes. So again, that planning to plan, make sure you look under all of those racks or look in those historic reviews, or anything that you're doing now will likely save you time later. Answer questions based on known information. Do not guess or assume. I think we've provided enough primary resources for you to consult based on all of the questions that you will be asked. So that information should be readily available. Well-written project descriptions along with clear, well-labeled maps and photos aid MDEM and FEMA staff during the evaluation process. Again, they review a lot of these. They don't know them as well as you do. So the idea being, when you hand that application off to them, they have all of the information to basically tell the whole story. They don't have to guess. Complete scopes of work and clear documentation equals EHP review foundation. And making their job easier, makes them have a better understanding of your project. And that's really the ultimate goal, meeting the requirements and allowing the reviewers to have a good, clear understanding of what you're proposing. And here are a number of other resources. Again, the slides will be available to you after this workshop. Between MDEM and FEMA has some really great EHP assistance documentation. Their checklist and screening form. There is the link to FEMA Go. The flood mitigation guide, the Maryland Historical Trust has some wonderful documentation on considering hazard planning and historic structures. And the EHP, there is an actual place that you can contact at FEMA, and here is their email address if you have questions about the process. And here is also the updated MDEM mitigation email in case you have questions after this about EHP or anything else as you're going along in the process. And again, here are some other resources, different online maps, places that you can print from. And again, it's really great now how many resources are online, because 5 years ago, this was not the case. So hopefully this takes a lot of the guesswork out of the process. This is where the primary sources are. This has the up-to-date information, and you don't need to, run around looking at all these different places. This is like one-stop shopping for you. So I think we're done, and I think I just got it within the time. And Jaleesa, I don't know if you want to wait until the end of your program to entertain questions, or do we want to do it now?
Okay, perfect. So I think we can pause right here and start doing any questions for the EHP stuff because it's such a good information. And I know that this tends to be one of the sessions where we have a lot of questions based on people's like specific projects that they're doing. So if you want to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, and you can also come off mute to do that as well too. If you are calling in on the phone, you have to press *67 in order to unmute yourself.
And if anyone has questions, I mean, a lot of times this is so much information. If you think of something after the workshop, absolutely feel free to email us, and Jaleesa will make sure that your question, comes to us so we can take a look and give you an answer. And that's perfectly fine. This is so much information to absorb.
Hey, Jaleesa, this is Kara. I apologize if this was already covered. The first part of the call, I had to sit through the swim call. For the historic review, where we have to send that paper to the Maryland Historic Trust, I think is what it's called, is that still only a mail-in paper process? When I was on their website, that's what it had listed there. So I was just wondering if you have any insight on that, because it's like a 30-day turnaround time.
I think you are talking about the like state clearinghouse process, maybe. But there shouldn't be anything that you have to send in to the Maryland Historic Trust yourself directly. So what usually happens is that you do kind of this front end work. So some of those things that Terry mentioned, like if you have buildings that are 50 years or over, going ahead and submitting like the pictures and different things for that. So once FEMA receives it, is they need to do any like further EHP focused reviews, they will come back to us with their request for information, so we can start that process and do the consultations with like the state historic preservation officer. They're called the SHPO. It's not as fun as an acronym as SHMO. So that's how that process will go. But you will not need to contact MHT directly for anything.
Right, Kara, I think I know what you're talking about. And if you were proposing another project from your jurisdiction, you would fill out that project review form on their project review page at MHT. The way this is going to work is you don't need to initiate that consultation directly as a local jurisdiction. It's all kind of packaged into this review process. So you're providing similar if you know you have a historic structure right away, you can put together that kind of documentation that you would typically send to MHT with that project review form as part of your EHP submission. Because again, everyone is going to use that same type of baseline information, but you do not need to initiate that separately with MHT. It's rolled into this whole process.
Okay, that clarifies a lot for me. Thank you. And Jaleesa, is this the same process for the HMGP since it doesn't go through the FEMA review?
Yep, correct. So this will basically be the same process for HMGP, SMA, and BRIC. Yep.
Okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome. And do we have any other questions? All right, so hearing none, we will now kind of jump into some final financial considerations as you all kind of head into finalizing your project applications as well too. And again, should you have additional questions that you think about as you start developing your application, you can reach out to us. Remember, the email address has changed, so it's mitigation.mdim@maryland.gov. So we will jump right into this. So one thing we get asked a lot about is pre-award costs. So basically, pre-award costs are costs that you might incur upfront in order to develop your sub-application. So last year with BRIC, FEMA kind of removed some of the time limits that they had on when you could start kind of like claiming these costs, but you still have to be reasonable. But essentially, it's going to be things like if you contracted out the development of your benefit cost analysis, if you had to do any design and engineering work in order to put together your application, if you had to incur any costs to get together like preliminary EHP documentation. So it will include different costs like that. When you prepare your project budget, again, for all three programs, you actually have to include your pre-award costs as a line item within the project budget. So that way, again, if you're asking for reimbursement for those pre-award costs, it can go ahead and be factored into the total project cost for that 75-25% split for the cost share. Another very important thing, though, is that the pre-award costs are only reimbursed if your project is actually awarded. So definitely make sure you are keeping record of costs that you incur and different things like that. But also keep in mind that it will only be reimbursable if your project is actually awarded, right? So then the other kind of additional cost category is for management costs. So management costs are 100% funded. So think of this as kind of like in two buckets. You have one bucket that will have your project costs, which includes pre-award costs, and that is subject to the cost share, which the standard cost share is the 25%, 75% split. And this other bucket, separate from your project costs, you have the ability to also request management costs. The management cost, that is a straight grant. So 100% of that will be provided by your federal dollars. For these different projects, you are permitted to request up to 5% of your project budget as management costs. So bear with me as I try and do this math on the fly, but let's say that you have a $10,000 project. You can request up to 5% of that $10,000. I'm not gonna try and do it in my head. I know those are simple numbers. I'm gonna mess it up. 5% of the $10,000 you can request a management cost, and you would get that full amount without having it be subjected to a cost share. So think about your management costs as your like administrative expenses for being able to implement that exact project. So management costs can cover salaries. However, a lot of times within our state, our communities don't utilize management costs for salaries because oftentimes salaries are used as the in-kind share to meet the required 25% non-federal share for the project cost. So this is also something really important to look into, and we want to make sure that everybody is well aware of this so that they don't miss this opportunity to receive that additional support that they might need to implement their project. So then when you start putting together your project budget, you want to make sure that the costs that you are putting in for are actually allowable. So they have to be necessary and reasonable to actually implement your project. So let's say if you were doing a home elevation project, right? So chances are, hopefully, you would not need to rent a bulldozer in order to do that, because hopefully we are not disturbing that much ground around that property where that will be needed. So again, it needs to be reasonable and it needs to be necessary. Also, if there are any like limitations on the dollar amounts for certain things, you want to be cognizant of that. Make sure that it is consistent throughout your application. So a lot of times last year, we got feedback from FEMA that there were inconsistencies between information actually provided in applications versus like the supporting documentation that was provided by the sub-applicants to support that. So if you are going through like reiterations and updating and revising documents and different things like that, just make sure that you kind of do a quality control check to make sure that all your numbers and data is consistent throughout the entire package. Okay. Costs must also be reasonable. So this kind of goes without saying, like, you know, you have to provide documentation for your costs as well too. So most of the time, if it's going to be for a construction budget, it's either going to be, you know, your local experts, like your Department of Public Works. They will say, okay, well, these are like the standard industry rates for, you know, a culvert project like this. Or if you are doing like a elevation project, normally you will obtain bids for your application and kind of say, okay, this is like the average that we've received for like how much this project would actually cost. So you want to make sure that all that information is reasonable and then support it with additional documentation as well too. Okay. So eligible costs, so examples we are starting to kind of make this transition in Maryland from our smaller projects to a lot of the projects we saw this year were larger scale infrastructure projects. I think everybody is probably well aware of how construction costs and materials, the costs have really fluctuated, to say the least, over the past few months. So I really want to encourage everybody to be very mindful of that for your construction activities this year, and make sure that you also include a line item in your budget for contingencies. So the contingency can be requested up to a total of 5% of your project cost. And so that helps us because what we've experienced like this past year, we know that these are a lengthy involved process. So we've had people, let's just say that they put together their initial applications in 2019 for like 2020 funding. So 2019, they got quotes, they got bids, and then the projects are awarded, you know, 8 months later in 2020. And by the time they start getting everything to go and start construction and break ground, the construction costs had skyrocketed. Now, in most circumstances, there is really not a pathway for us to be able to request additional federal funds to cover these types of cost increases. So it's really important that we give enough like forward thinking about this and make sure that we try and include these contingency line items to cover any type of increases like that. So please, if you are doing a construction project, definitely kind of think through that and, you know, provide the support and documentation to include a contingency line item in there. So other examples of eligible costs are going to include design and engineering. Again, if you're doing a construction project, the labor, the materials for your project, inspections and permits, actual construction costs, and then your project administration or project management too. Right. So for some certain types of projects, MEMA, they do have very detailed lists about what is eligible and what is not eligible. Most of the time, these are for projects that are more so, I say like they're more standard across the board. So like this is an example of eligible property costs for property acquisition and demolition projects. So again, they've really laid it out in details about what can be paid for. So if you are doing a elevation or an acquisition, make sure that you also look at the 2015 Hazard Mitigation Assistance Guidance Addendum, because that's where it really spells out a lot of these different things and gives you very specific information on how to develop and implement those projects. All right. So as far as reimbursement, and I know that this seems very like premature to discuss before you even put together your application, but we get asked these questions a lot still. People kind of want to know, well, if I put the application in, can I go ahead and start the project and then get reimbursed? So that is not exactly what we mean when we say that this is like a strictly reimbursement program. So you're not permitted to start any work before you actually get formally approved by FEMA. If you start any work before you get that approval, you risk putting your entire property or project in jeopardy, or else it just not being funded and you not being able to recoup any of your costs at all. So it needs to be funded or approved first before you start any work. And then once you do start the work, we operate on a reimbursement basis. So you would need to pay the cost that you have incurred, and then you will come back to the department to MDM and request those funds, and then we will reimburse you with that funding. And I also point this out because a lot of people, we get questions about, will this be like a lump sum where it's kind of like, okay, you put in the application, you get the project awarded, and do we just come and hand you like one check for total project cost? No. So everything is done based on the actual cost that you incur and that you have paid. So it's reimbursement. Don't start any work beforehand. All right. So some additional reminders. Again, if there is anything you take away from all the technical assistance outreach that we've done, is that documentation is the most important thing. And I always tell people, even when it's something that you think, oh, I'm using like census data, like, yes, it's a, different arm of federal government, like FEMA will know that this is okay. No, you should still PDF, the website where you're getting your census data, and then attach that to your application as documentation as well too. So that's also going to be really important with the cost. You want to make sure that all of those are well documented and you have the justification for the cost that you are requesting. Don't use any lump sum costs either. They all need to be broken down by line items so that we are able to decipher exactly what amount of funding is being requested for what materials or tasks within the project. And then the last thing is just that I like to make sure people are aware of the provisions surrounding utilizing contractor support for developing your applications and then subsequently implementing your projects as well too. In general, the way I like to describe this is that you cannot have somebody help you write the test and then they also get to take the test as well. All right, so if you have a contractor who has helped you like specifically develop your grant application, and I don't mean that they've provided like a quote that you're using for your documentation, I mean that they've like quite honestly have been hands-on in developing your project application, they are then prohibited from being able to complete the work should your project be approved. So I've put the relevant sections from the Code of Federal Regulations up there if there's anybody that needs to do a deeper dive to make sure, that their situation is okay, that's there. But I do like to let people know that up front so it's not a surprise when you get your project awarded and then we say, oh, well, XYZ organization actually cannot bid on your project. All right. So that is all I have as far as financial considerations today. Again, our email address has changed. It is mitigation.mdim@maryland.gov now. Tell your coworkers, tell your friends, so that they make sure they can actually get in touch with us. But other than that, we have sufficient time to just kind of take questions should you have any today. And also we do have FEMA representatives on the line today as well too. So I will stop speaking now and see if anybody has questions. And as a reminder, it is *6 to unmute yourself. Okay, and hearing none, and assuming that I have not completely lost connection and no one can actually hear me, I don't see any questions. So again, should you have any questions as you start going through, finalizing your application, feel free to reach out to us through email, and we will also provide the slides from today as well too. And the recordings from all the presentations will be uploaded to our website. And so other than that, thank you all, and good luck with developing your project. Have a nice day.
Hi, Jaleesa. This is BJ with FEMA.
Hey, BJ.
I just wanted to jump in to say, no, you have not lost audio with everyone. And and that I really enjoyed the course, and y'all did a fabulous job with this today. So thank you very much. You're going to get great applications.
Perfect. Thank you so much, BJ.
Thank you for the feedback.
You're most welcome.
Thank you, everyone.